Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending on where you are on this fast forward planet, which is still wrapped in a pandemic. And it's hard to kind of absorb that when life feels normal again, but it's definitely not. And more such threats are on the horizon, especially at this interface between ecology and humans on the resource frontiers around the world. We're on an overheating planet. Humans are changing the climate, and humans are actually then moving into regions of climate faster than they're changing the climate, which has led to all these this continual flood, literally, of news around climate change. Forest conservation is a key to planetary health. It's a key to climate dynamics, not just through CO2, but through the way moisture moves through forests. I was privileged in the late 80s to spend time in the Amazon rainforest writing my book about the murder of Chico Mendez, the burning season. And that's when I really absorbed that uh, the relationship, the future of forests is very much a human story about people who live there um, sustainably and who have been, you know, pushed out or um, I'm Andy Revkin at the Columbia Climate School. If I freeze occasionally, it's because I'm now working out of rural Maine, and we're not hardwired to the internet yet. Thanks to Elon Musk, we have a pretty good connection, but we haven't chopped down enough trees to have a good view of the satellites. So if I freeze, my guests will fill in the blanks. And I've got a wonderful array of guests here today um, on this session, which we're calling "How to Improve Conservation Funding with a Local and Indigenous Focus." And it's really focused on this report that came out from Rights and Resources, which is a global network looking at just those two things, rights and resources, and especially on frontline communities in forest regions of the earth. But this extends well beyond the tropics. The report is examining this, revealing that there's a disconnect between a lot of interest and a lot of funding flowing toward projects involving or amplifying or nurturing indigenous capacity to be guardians and to understand the way the world works from that from their standpoint. The problem is, as the report reveals, most of the money is having a hard time kind of getting to where it would be most needed. Indigenous engagement in how the process plays out is limited, and we're going to talk about both the findings and solutions. The guests here today are Solange Bandiaky-Badji, who is president and coordinator of the Rights and Resources Initiative, Pam McElwee, a Rutgers professor of human ecology, who's dug deep and come up with peer-reviewed work that shows the value of communities, local, traditional, and indigenous communities, in sustaining the dynamics of forests that the broader world cares about. And Kevin Curry, who's at the Ford Foundation, a longtime supporter through funding and other work of Indigenous capacity to be who they want to be and to help sustain these resources. It's great to have you all here today. So let's just start a little bit with a bit of a hello. I'm on Abenaki, Penobscot terrain now in Maine, on the coast, not far from Desert Island. I had been coming with this show through in the last 30 years I'd spent in the Hudson Valley, which was only named for Henrik Hudson because he stumbled into that river in 1609, this Dutch guy. But of course, that goes back in Lenape history, thousands of years. So let's say just a quick hello. Where are you? How are you doing? Solange, again, you run this global network. You're based, I think, in DC, but you obviously have a global view of things. How are you doing?
Hello, everyone, and thanks, Andy, for having me. Actually, I'm calling from New York City.
All
I'm
right, lots going on.
participating at the UN Climate Week, and I'm based in Washington, D.C., and in the Secretariat of the Rights and Resources Initiative, which is a global coalition of right holders, organizations, and their allies advocating for the rights of local communities and indigenous peoples to land and to resources. So it's a broader network. And Washington, D.C., we are the secretariat, but the members are in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and across the world.
Great. And Pam, I think you're at or around Rutgers right now, but you're heading off soon for on sabbatical back into the field. So how are you doing?
Good. Yeah, I'm joining you from New Jersey. So, like you said, like the Hudson Valley, this is the traditional lands of the Lenape. And so, wanted to acknowledge that Indigenous rights and resources are important when all the places that we're calling from. And it's great to focus on them in this discussion. And yes, a lot of my work actually happens to be in Southeast Asia, and I'm lucky enough to have a sabbatical this year. So, in a couple of weeks, I am taking off for Vietnam, where I do a lot of work with some Indigenous communities there, thinking about securing their rights, looking at the outcomes of all of the things they get from nature, from clean water, clean air, and how do we actually build that into policy, which has been really challenging for a lot of Indigenous and local communities. They're sort of excluded from this, as we will hear today. So that's exciting to get to go back in the field soon.
That's great. And Kevin, I assume you're in New York, unless not drawn into the maelstrom of Climate Week.
I am. Nice to see you and Andy and colleagues here. I'm in the Ford Foundation office, working the Natural Resources and Climate Change program. Sorry, Solange, we should have coordinated. I could be sitting next to you behind your beautiful virtual background.
This is true. So this report has made a little bit of news, mostly in the press that pay attention to such things. Here is coverage in Triple Pundit that Indigenous peoples and local communities need more say in where their conservation funding goes. So Solange, maybe you could start by just, and this is with the Rainforest Foundation Norway, I think as well. What stimulated this report? What's the gap? What's the need? What drove you to do this?
Thanks, Andy, for this question. And as you rightly said, this report is a joint effort between Rainforest Foundation Norway and the Rights and Resources Initiative. And what's the rationale behind producing this report? And as you know, RRI is a global coalition, and we have right holders organization, Indigenous peoples, local communities, Afro-descendant people, and women within those communities who have their own organization are part of the coalition. And Rainforest Foundation Norway also has been working and engaging a lot with right holders organization on the ground. And what we have been hearing over the years from the right holders organization is that we want to make sure that funding comes directly to us. We have been hearing lots of billions circulating, but we're not seeing it. Or if we're seeing it, it's also very little. So they requested RRI and Rainforest Foundation Norway to really look into tracking donor finance for Indigenous peoples and local community rights and climate. So it's really looking into the disbursement, what are donors funding, and how are they focusing on rights and climate. That's really the rationale behind this report. So I don't know if I can jump in directly into talking about really, some of the key findings.
Sure, I think that's a good start.
Of this report, and mainly the gaps. What are the gaps that we found, and how we have been talking about it in the report. So one is really there is a lack of direct access to funding by Indigenous peoples and local communities. And our report reveals that only 17% of Indigenous people and local community tenure and forest management funding between 2011 and 2020 directly reach like an IP or LC organization, indicating that a low share of this funding is currently being used by Indigenous and community organizations on the ground. So that's one major gap there. We also found a lack of accountability and transparency from certain donors toward right holders organization or IPLCs. And here, when I say IP and LCs, I'm referring to Indigenous peoples and local communities.
Right.
And we found that, in inhibiting these communities' understanding and influence over donor priorities and decision. For example, most private foundations do not share data on their projects systematically. And there's a missing gap actually for public access to that information. And third, we also see a general lack of flexibility to change or adapt priorities within project, restrict right holders organization in addressing diverse community needs and imminent threats, or says a window of opportunity. And here it's really about the gender gap. What we found is that only 27% of IPLC tenure and forest management funding included gender-related keywords, despite, the essential role of women, Indigenous women, local women in forest management, but also how they have been excluded in many governance structures and forest management decisions. Then I think here there is really a huge gap, not only about keywords, but I think we need to maybe even dig deeper and find out, okay, beyond the numbers, beyond the keywords, what else has been included or not. But that's also maybe another big topic or analysis that need to be done. And finally, due to strict eligibility and administrative requirements of bilateral and multilateral donors, Indigenous peoples and local community organizations must overcome considerable barriers to access funding. So funding for IPLC tenure and forest management has therefore generally relied on traditional official development assistance funding structures, with national and international organizations acting as intermediaries. So these are really the 5 major gaps that we found and we have been trying to address throughout the report.
That's great. Pam, could you just offer a little bit of a word picture of what is meant by local communities? This is something I think a lot of people don't appreciate. The word indigenous relates to communities that have historically been in a place for millennia in many cases, but there's a mosaic of other kinds of communities.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was part of the 2019 global assessment that was done by the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And one of the things we tried to figure out is how many people are there that would be classified as Indigenous people in local communities, and what sort of role they play in land management, because it was a report that was really trying to take a global perspective on conservation lands and so forth. And as you say, I think most people recognize the concept of Indigenous peoples. I will say there's still an enormous problem with a lot of governments not recognizing the Indigenous peoples within their territories. This is certainly true in Southeast Asia, where I work. And so we've got the problem of a lack of recognition of, just the people themselves, let alone their territorial claims. But then there's also some ambiguity in other places where Indigenous peoples doesn't always cover the range of people's longstanding relationships with nature. And so a classic example that a lot of people point to is in the continent of Africa, where you have different understandings of what counts as Indigenous and longstanding and so forth. And so this extra category of local communities turns out to be really helpful in those situations where either the government doesn't recognize Indigenous peoples, or there's some question about whether or not that's the right term. And so it just helps us encompass. But it's this idea that people have longstanding ties with nature. And the folks that we're calling IPLCs essentially have management and territorial claims to at least 25% of the terrestrial Earth surface. I mean, at a minimum, it's probably much larger, but that we can certainly establish 25%. And as Solange was just saying, they're not getting access to funding commensurate with the roles they're playing in those land management decisions.
Right. And again, the chunk of that planet that external experts have deemed vital to preserve for its biological diversity or climate benefits is even larger percentage would be occupied by Indigenous or these kinds of local communities, right?
That's right.
And the Biological Diversity Treaty, the climate process, there's been a move in recent years to have more of a voice there, but they're not really formally integrated into those processes yet too.
No, so much of our intergovernmental negotiations are state to state. And that's a real problem for Indigenous peoples who are either not recognized by their state, don't have a seat at the table. So it's gotten better in recent years. There is more voice and space for Indigenous peoples organizations at things like the Convention on Biological Diversity, but it's not equivalent to states, right? The actual negotiations that are going on in rooms are often just countries talking to one another. And so that's a huge problem as well.
Yeah, and you don't want it to just be a sort of a virtue signal. We're going to fly a bunch of Indigenous representatives to Glasgow or next to Sharm el Sheikh and have them make presentations. It just doesn't cut it. A little bit from Kevin on, tell us what you do at Ford. I know you all have been very, in a sustained way, supportive of Indigenous communication and empowerment and the like through the rights lens for sure. So where does Ford come in? And then maybe you could talk a little bit about the wider landscape of philanthropy around this.
Yeah, sure. The Ford Foundation overall is focused on reducing inequality. And when you look at inequality in relationship to ownership and control of land and territories, that puts you working alongside Indigenous peoples and local communities to try to help them build power and have their rights recognized over the resources that they protect. The last 10 years, there's been a huge increase in scientific evidence showing that when Indigenous peoples and local communities do have secure rights to their lands, territories, and resources, that those lands and territories are better protected. And that's especially true in terms of tropical forests, where you have rates of deforestation inside of Indigenous territories, which are much lower than in comparable areas outside of those territories. So if we're able to help Indigenous peoples and local communities to protect their lands and resources, we have a much better chance of stopping deforestation, protecting biodiversity, improving public health, and mitigating climate change. But what we've seen is that even though the evidence for that has increased, and Pam's work has played a really important role in that, the recognition of that evidence has increased. The funding for the communities doing this work on the ground has not increased at all. In fact, it's been flat for 2 decades. And the funding that they're getting, these communities, which are, as Pam said, controlling at least 25% of the Earth's surface, is less than $300 million a year for all of those communities across that entire area. So essentially, we've had communities who have been doing the work of protecting forests and biodiversity on the ground with virtually no external financial support. Imagine what these communities can accomplish if they're properly resourced. And so I think that's what's important about this report that RI and RFN have put together, is really focusing our attention on the next phase of the battle, helping Indigenous peoples and local communities get the money that they need to do the work that they're doing.
Yeah. By the way, I'm showing one of my favorite examples of how this uncompensated conservation works. This is the Shingu Park in Brazil. And of course, a park is only a park, especially in large areas like the Amazon or peripheral areas, if there's something more than fences and guards. And you can see here the Shingu territory had resisted through that period, right through 2018. And it goes on, the massive deforestation around it. So this gets to Pam's work again, which in a more dynamic community-based way demonstrates through science this effect. So maybe Pam, if there's some particular study or example that comes to mind for you, where you sort of the data really drive home this point about the clear value, and then we'll get back into the report.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's multiple lines of evidence. It's not just a single study. We've got a couple of big ones that have happened recently. For example, there was a paper in 2021 in Nature Sustainability, where the author team used remotely sensed data to try to assess where deforestation and degradation was happening globally and compare Indigenous controlled territories and Indigenous lands with traditional protected areas. And what they essentially found was they looked at, I think there's something like 3.4 million square kilometers of Indigenous lands, and I think protected areas is somewhere on the order of 2 million square kilometers. Is that deforestation was reduced in those Indigenous lands as compared to non-Indigenous lands equivalent to protected areas. Like they were doing all the functions of protected areas in almost every continent. And in Africa, they were doing better. They were doing better than protected areas. So it's that sort of data that really, I think, makes the case for what Solange and Kevin have been saying, which is we've got folks that are doing the work on the ground of protecting forests, contributing to storehouses of biodiversity and stocks of carbon, and they're doing it at a minuscule amount of the funding that traditional protected areas receive. And so that's the problem. And that's why it's so important to have a report like this point out those gaps, because we know based on science, based on our assessments, that biodiversity loss is happening less common in indigenous lands. Multiple studies that have shown this, that if you actually compare rates of biodiversity loss across countries, indigenous lands are equivalent to protected areas. That's not to say there's zero biodiversity loss in indigenous territories, because what's actually happening is they're having to fight off a lot of threats from mining and hydropower and so forth.
Right.
So they are experiencing some degradation despite their best efforts. And that's where the funding can really be helpful, because of those external threats that are causing biodiversity loss despite their very best efforts.
So that takes us back to the report. What's the reception been so far, Solange? And just thinking about, I don't know if there's examples where things are working the right way that you could mention that were touched on in the report, or that you know about or working on.
Yep. And if you just allow me, before coming back to the report and adding
Yeah.
to the statistics and that Kevin and Pam have provided, at RRI, we also published a report last year called the Right-Based Conservation, the Path to Preserving Earth Biological and Cultural Diversity. So we call it the 30 by 30 analysis. So what we found in terms of statistics is that some 300 billion people live in areas targeted for tropical forest restoration. And also 1.8 billion indigenous peoples, local communities, Afro-descendant, live in the planet's most important biodiversity conservation. And the reason why I'm raising this here is that we're talking about how to reach the 30 by 30 target. And this shows that if we really want to reach the 30 by 30 target, this analysis shows that we need right-based conservation as the viable path to achieve that ambitious goal, but also investing really in the communities that matter the most. So just wanted to add that, just to say that there are more studies actually showing why we need to invest in local communities and indigenous peoples' territories. And coming back to the report, I mean, in terms of examples, I mean, what we're seeing, we have growing examples of fund that indigenous networks have founded themselves to ensure funding goes directly to communities on the ground. And I'll just name few here. One example is AMAN in Indonesia, which stands for the Indigenous Peoples Alliance of the Archipelago, which helps millions of indigenous Indonesians reclaim their right to own and manage their forest land. And AMAN had helped a community in the island of Borneo to protect 10,000 hectares of land from external threat. AMAN also, as an indigenous network, has set up high standards of accountability by publishing regular financial statement and annual audit of its project, and it's all public. So I think this also could serve as an example to the donors who are not really willing to make public their funding sources and how much they're providing. Another example is the Podali Fund in Brazil, which is acting as an intermediary for indigenous organizations across the rainforest of the Brazilian Amazon. We have also the Mesoamerica Fund. And actually tomorrow, the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities at the UN Climate Week will launch the Shangia mechanism. These are just few examples of several grassroots organizations that have created their own fund to scale indigenous and community-led initiatives that conventional development finance is failing to reach. And finally, our coalition, under the guidance of indigenous and community leaders, established earlier this year a new funding mechanism called Clarify, Community Land Rights and Conservation Finance Initiative. And currently we're testing a pilot with our partners to see how we can ensure that funding goes directly to communities in different landscapes and ecosystem.
Those are fantastic initiatives to hear about. It's almost like we could do a separate show on each one. Maybe we'll get to that down the line. I did a session, I think, with some folks from the Amman network here a year or two ago. Pam, I think you were on that one about. And so what I think maybe it's worth having a little bit more detail on how Indigenous communities do protect the land. Historically, and this gets to some things that Kevin and Ford Foundation have supported, the communication capacity of people in these regions to be a sort of an alert system for when illegal mining is spreading or the like is one. What are the other ways this works? What are the ways that how much of it's a feedback mechanism? How much of it is what are the other ways that works? Maybe Pam and Kevin, you could touch on that too. Just a little, again, a word picture on what is it that these communities do that makes the difference.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that and then turn to Kevin. I mean, I think there's multiple pathways, and the point that this report makes and that other folks have been making is that those are pathways that Indigenous communities need to choose themselves for their own circumstances. But just to give some examples, in some cases, it might be helping to provide salaries so we can get more people on the front line to kind of act as rangers, right? Because it's taking them away from their family and their food production to do that. So that might be a model in some place. It might be setting up small scale sustainable development enterprises to provide some sort of way to, promote food more sustainably, or some sort of other thing that folks are growing, find markets for that. Who knows? I mean, there could be lots of different models that people have. One that I like to talk about and stress is that Indigenous knowledge is so important for this system to work, because so much of the care and reciprocity that Indigenous communities have towards nature has been passed down through generations, through stories and tales and intimate ties within communities. But that often gets lost as people are sort of shunted into formal education systems, or don't have opportunities to do that sort of sharing and experience. And so that could be a model that could be funded as well. Better opportunities for passing on the really important traditional knowledge that people have to the younger generations. The younger generations don't feel like they have to go to the city to get work and then, lose out those opportunities for learning. So there's all sorts of different pathways. But I think what's really important is that those are pathways that need to be chosen by the Indigenous communities themselves.
Yeah, and that's something I think it's hard sometimes for the outside community to let go of control of, because sometimes it's complicated. In Brazil, there are Indigenous communities that made arrangements with soybean farmers to cultivate their land. In other words, the rights don't always align with perhaps with broader sense of sustainability, but to me, the rights dominates. Having that understanding is important. In Brazil, there were actually different government agencies were essentially fighting over this. The environmental agency was saying this has to stop, and they were fining some Indigenous communities, while the organization within the government that is all about Indigenous empowerment was saying, no, they have the right. Mm-hmm. Does that gets complicated? So Kevin, again, from this idea of traditional models of philanthropy are very much, when I was at the National Geographic Society, where I still am on judging grants and things, this M&E always comes up: measurement and evaluation. And how much does that have to evolve? The way organizations, whether it's Ford or some of the broader, bigger other organizations are out there, how much do they need to sort of evolve how they look at success?
Well, I think in one sense we're quite lucky, because as you showed a moment ago with your satellite imagery from Brazil, this is the kind of work whose success you can literally see from space. And so it is quite easy to demonstrate the impact of supporting and empowering Indigenous peoples and local communities who have long-standing connections to their natural resources, which are spiritual and cultural, who are incentivized to protect the resources that sustain them and provide their food, clothing, shelter, medicine, etc. But I think it's also important to note that these are communities that have developed collective governance systems through collective institutions that allow them to make decisions about those lands and resources. But I think it's also important in terms of talking about impact to compare Indigenous and community management of forests to the alternative. And the alternative is what you can see happening in places like Brazil, where communities are being run off their land as forests cleared for pasture for cattle, for soybean, and other places for palm oil, for rubber, other agricultural commodities, to make way for mines, oil and gas extraction. We're increasingly seeing narco trafficking and illegal gold mining as important drivers of deforestation in Latin America. And so in many places, these communities are quite literally the last line of defense, and often, again, literally putting their bodies on the line for land and environment defenders killed every week for protecting their resources. And that's why it's important to invest in this. Just last thing I'll say, what I find is a really alarming statistic is that if you look in the Amazon basin, Indigenous forests are a net carbon sink. They're still taking more carbon out of the atmosphere. But other forests not managed by Indigenous peoples are now a net carbon source. They're a cause of more emissions than the trees are actually able to sequester. So that again is this, it really shows on a global scale the importance of the work that Indigenous peoples and local communities are doing, and for which they're still receiving very little recognition.
So, and I guess this will get to beyond the philanthropy question, is how can this be integrated into finance itself, which is bigger than philanthropy for projects, but how does the world find mechanisms for the sustainable development goals that where a company or others can kind of sort of just directly put the money where the impact is? And I think that seems to be another arena to look at. I'm not sure if the report gets into that, but the whole idea of carbon finance, climate finance, SDG finance, how does that relate to the Indigenous empowerment as well? Seems to be ripe. If anyone has any thoughts, that'd be great. And then we can get back to some conclusions and some questions that are coming in from people watching.
Just a couple of thoughts. So first of all, the easiest thing that we can do is to increase public bilateral finance and philanthropic finance that goes to support Indigenous peoples and local communities because of the benefits for climate, gender justice, racial justice, public health, biodiversity, etc. Ford Foundation was happy to be part of a group of 5 governments and 16 other foundations and funders who in COP26 in Glasgow committed to spending $1.7 billion over the next 5 years supporting Indigenous and local community tenure rights and forest guardianship. If we're able to implement that commitment successfully, that would be about a 2.5 times increase in funding going to this issue above the baseline. Obviously, that's still wildly insufficient. And Solange can tell you more about some of the calculations RI has done on the need for this space, which is at least $1 billion a year. But it would be a start. And with that start, that would allow communities to start developing longer term plans for thinking about other pathways for finance.
And again, Solange, the report that came out last week was just one small part of what you all work on at Rights and Resources. So presumably there's other work that relates to this process too. And by the way, if there is anything else happening at Climate Week this week that you want me to draw attention to, I can try to pull that up on the screen too.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in addition to what Kevin said, which I do really agree with, in the report, actually, we have given concrete steps that donors can take to remedy each gap that we've identified. First, I think it's important to make projects led by Indigenous people and local communities, right? So we don't always see them as merely beneficiaries, but see them as thought partners, thought leaders. So there's a co-creation when we develop a project, or even the funding. I mean, the funding should be really, we should find ways of including Indigenous people and local community leaders into the thinking, into the conception of a funding mechanism. And second, I think it's important to make funding flexible and long-term. And we have seen recently, actually, with response to COVID-19 crisis, that donors have become very flexible. Maybe we can try to see what were the model that was used and how can we, how it can serve as a great template for funding flexibility. And also, I mean, the gender inclusiveness, we would not talk about it enough. And I think there is a fatigue right now when wherever there is something happening, people are always finding that, women's rights, gender equality and all those inclusiveness is really left behind. How do we make sure that any, funding contribute to scaling up gender programming and Indigenous and local community women? And fourth, I would say that maybe make funding timely and accessible, and look into the existing criteria. The administrative requirements need to be simplified. The donors need to remove barriers for direct funding, because we cannot treat Indigenous organizations as Western NGOs. They don't really match. How do you make sure that you can come up with criteria that speak to the local context? And last but not least, I mean, strengthen mutual accountability among donors. I think it's important, really, for private foundation, they need to step up their game and meet or exceed the transparency of bilateral and multilateral solutions by uploading data of their funding to a standardized and public database. I think that will help people contribute and really provide some additional feedback.
I wanted to bring up one model that I became involved with sort of late in the game. The Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation, something like 5 or 6 years ago, funded a project in the Arctic, Kotzebue, with the Inupiat community there, and some climate scientists at University of Alaska and at Columbia. Together, they evolved a project on sea ice. The sea ice off of their part of the Chukchi Sea was very unstable and changing. And it's come out now with I think 5 or 6 peer-reviewed papers, all co-authored by the community elders and experts and the scientists, or the Western experts. But what was cool about it was more, the funding was basically to build the relationship. It wasn't outcome-based funding. It was a chunk of money. It's like $3 or $4 million to build this understanding and fluency between the Arctic community experts and elders and these scientists. And I've gotten to know the scientists and a couple of the elders, and it really did, especially on the science end, it really changed how they think. They hadn't been exposed to any of this in grad school or the like. And I think it's had a broader impact at Columbia already. So more seems to be on the case. I don't know, again, if anything else comes to mind for models that kind of can capture what Solange was laying out there, which is so important, the co-design, and not just of the project, but of the goal. It seems to be really a key opportunity. What else out there does excite you to fill that gap in a way that really works for the communities on the front lines?
Well, I just add one of the things that I've been involved in has been these intergovernmental panels, and they are increasingly recognizing Indigenous and local knowledge as part of the information base in these global assessments. These are like from the IPCC or IPBES, and they have helped make the case in understanding the important role that Indigenous peoples have played in land management, as we've already talked about. But I think one of the, as you said, one of the big outcomes of trying to do a better engagement with Indigenous knowledge is the scientists themselves change. And they recognize that they do not have a monopoly on knowledge, and particularly getting folks to move away from this idea that, like, well, there might be Indigenous knowledge, but we have to validate it through science. Like, we have to get away from that. That's not what it's there for, right? And so we have to have different models. And I think the one you just mentioned is a fantastic one, where it's about co-production. It's really working together to think about how we monitor and understand environmental change and so forth. And I've done this, trying to do this at the global level through some of these global panels. But I think they've been really helpful in two ways. The scientists benefit from them, but it also helps us at the global level understand who uses these reports. Can they be helpful for Indigenous communities to make the case for their governments? For example, if you don't recognize us, but these global assessments point out how important our land management skills are. So if you won't listen to us, listen to the IPCC or the IPBES, so that there's different ways we can use this knowledge for a sort of cross-pollination and knowledge to action approach, which I'm really excited about.
How does that resonate with you, Solange?
Yeah, I mean, one thing we see donors getting right is that many of them are increasingly providing funding through long-term funding agreements, which provide right holder organization with much needed predictability and security. We see this as a healthy trend and start, though there's still need for more flexibility in funding. We also appreciate a genuine effort to engage directly with community leaders and in thought leadership on changing mindset around funding by private donors. And here I would like just to name two. One is the Ford Foundation, not because Kevin is with us, but because RRI has been a long-standing grantees of the Ford Foundation since the beginning. And the Ford Foundation actually is a leading funder of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and has for years led the way for other donors to invest in this critically underfunded sector. And another one, I mean, we can praise many, but another one around putting funding to gender, we have the Wellspring Philanthropy Fund, which has committed to creating awareness among increasing international donors to fund Indigenous women and local women. And actually, they just funded some women's organization to launch a global call to action for gender inclusive climate finance and conservation. And last, we can talk about the new Bezos Earth Fund grant, which pretty much more than 70% of the grant goes to supporting directly Indigenous peoples and local communities. And really one that stands to me this year has been the Mackenzie Scott funding, which is totally unrestricted. You use it as you want. And that, to me, provides space for innovation and to just ask local communities and Indigenous people, what do they want to do? And here is the money, do it, because there's no restriction attached to it.
That's so interesting. The letting go process, yeah, it seems to be key. I have to bring up the Patagonia news, which was Patagonia historically has tried to make a big push for local and Indigenous consideration in how it does its work, and now it's going through this big reorganization, from the family company and foundation to something else. I don't know if anyone here has been dug in on that enough to. Does that fit with what you were saying about the Mackenzie Scott push, or is it yet to be determined? Maybe Solange.
I mean, one can say this is a very welcome news to really see that funding will be going more to supporting climate change. But again, the main question is, will the money trickle down to the territories, to supporting directly local organizations? And I think this is a very a key moment for Patagonia to see how to invest in supporting local initiatives, indigenous initiatives. And I think for me, this is a call for them to really start looking into what the indigenous peoples and local community have in place and what are the new mechanisms actually that are supporting directly indigenous peoples and local communities. And I think that could be really a game changer in the philanthropy world.
And Kevin, this reminds me of something you said a few minutes ago about the differential carbon impact of occupied forests and those that are occupied by more extractive human beings. It does feel like there's enough there to within the climate specific world to really dig in here.
Yeah, I think I mean, the Patagonia model, I think, is really exciting and provides a kind of new best practice for what companies need to do if they're really serious about fighting climate change. But I totally agree with Solange's comments. There's lots of big money out there coming into the climate space, and that's really great news. The question is, where will that money go, and is it really going to reach the grassroots communities who are doing the most important work on climate? One thing that gives me a lot of hope is seeing the indigenous peoples and local communities from tropical forests really getting organized to tell donors what they need. And you can see here in New York at Climate Week, one of the groups we work with, the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, has been here. If folks on Twitter, they can search for the hashtag Guardians of the Future to see some of the things that group has been working on here at Climate Week. But they've come with two messages. One, that they're a solution to climate change, and two, it's time to pay up. And what they're asking for is for trust, for donors to trust them, that they know their forests and territories better than anyone, and that they're able to manage money and make smart decisions about how that money is used and allocated. So I think that's the kind of culture shift we need in the funding world, to be able to let go of control and to believe in our partners on the ground, that they know how to manage money and they know how to put that money to work. And some of the funds that Solange mentioned earlier, which are managed and governed by indigenous peoples and local communities, offer really strong proof cases of that concept.
That's great. So there are a couple of questions and comments that came in that are worth exploring here. Thanks, anyone who's watching, either now or when we're done. You can share this video on the 4 different platforms it's streaming on. For just one quick hello from Honduras, Mario Pinel says saludos desde JCCG, Honduras. Sorry about my dog. Here, Robert Applebaum, in the book Climate Justice, Mary Robinson has a chapter on locals doing carbon budgets on the local forests in Vietnam. Well, that's relevant to Pam. I don't know if you're aware of that work, but interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of really nice models where the monitoring them is done by indigenous peoples themselves. And so all of the sort of ways in which we know how forests are changing because we're out there actually measuring them from the sky or on the ground and so forth. Those are things indigenous peoples can do themselves. They don't need scientists to come in and tell them how to do it. And so those sorts of things I think are really exciting. And Vietnam has a couple of models like that. Yeah.
That's great. Some of the partnerships that could spring from this really excite me. Several years ago, must have been early 2020 when pandemic was spreading. I did a session here with Dan Hammer, who's a young technologist, economist, who has worked on this platform called Earthrise to connect journalists with data on deforestation and the like. And they had built a way for students to engage as well. So you had students tracking Amazon imagery, helping to isolate and identify places where illegal gold mining intrusions were happening into Yanomami territory, and then media built stories around that. Reuters did a big special report. So those linkages that can emerge as well are just kind of cool. Melissa Hoffman from I'm a philanthropist turned farmer and chef, very interested in the subject on 1,300 acres in Vermont, livingfuture.org. And she says, I want to suggest you might contact Sean Smith, who is a Mexican-American, has indigenous heritage, and who is an international land conservation expert. I'll have to look her up. That's a female Sean. She also holds law degree, many years in complex appraisals. That's interesting. Well, we'll track down Sean Smith. If anyone else
be invited to that farm perhaps for a meal, and we can chat more about this.
That sounds good. Well, I'll see if I can connect with Melissa to follow up on that. I guess the next step is we have COP20. Right now we have the General Assembly, but then COP27 is coming in Sharm el Sheikh. I'm sure there's another biodiversity COP coming. I haven't kept track. They did
in December.
Yep. In December.
In Montreal. Yep.
Is there something we can push either on this platform, or what's the message that should go out now in the next month or two to inform those processes? I think I've heard several things today that I'll jot down when we're done. I'm going to write the results up here in my blog, but what's the message?
Yeah, I think what Solange said earlier about ensuring that the push, at least at the biodiversity COP, on 30 by 30, that we ought to protect 30% of the world's lands and waters, that must be done in conjunction with partnership with Indigenous peoples. It cannot be an external imposition that's decided by states, some of which don't even respect Indigenous rights or recognize them. And so the COP needs to take that seriously, that Indigenous lands are part of the solution, but it has to be done in the proper way that it acknowledges their rights. And so I think that's a message that Indigenous peoples have been taking to the COP and all of the preparatory meetings. So it's just a matter of getting all the other countries that are supposed to agree to the final wording of this next phase of the Biodiversity Convention, make sure those countries are on board with this. So I think the work that Solange and Kevin are doing is helping that stay front and center, which is great because that's where it needs to be.
Yeah. And to add to that, at the CBD COP, we will be organizing a one-day dialogue around Indigenous peoples' leadership in conservation, because I think they're playing a key role, but I think some people are still debating or not understanding what that role is, but it's a key leadership role. So it's important to highlight that. And by having a dialogue around that topic, we want to bring Indigenous people from the First Nations in Canada, right? The tribal nations in the US, and Indigenous people in the Global South to have a conversation and share initiatives, share ideas. And I think what we're aiming is maybe to come up with a joint statement to go and see how we can influence the CBD COP negotiation and outcomes. So I think this is also a key moment for more solidarity, more coordination among the Indigenous community across the world, and not see global north-south. I mean, they say that they are one Indigenous communities. I think this is also an approach that the donors could start really looking into.
Facilitating the crosstalk. Yes, in fact, the Ford Foundation, I think, has done some of this work 2 years ago or so. It was just before the pandemic. There was a meeting at the headquarters of this sort of story communication network for Indigenous communities. And a lot of what the interest was in crosstalk, not just getting our message out from the Yanomami to the world, but connecting laterally as well. And that seems to be facilitating that feels like a very important process. But you know what, that's also not the kind of thing funders like, because it's like funding a capacity is different than funding a project. So how much of this is that a key takeaway to supporting capacity development as opposed to a project with a beginning, middle, and an end?
I think so. I mean, one of the clear messages we're getting from partners is that this is very difficult long-term work, and it's not something that's going to happen in a year or 2 years, and it's not something that can easily be described in a log frame or a project table. That what we're talking about is people defending their homes And that's going to be ongoing work that needs to go on forever. But we also know that it's urgent because of the climate crisis and because protecting the world's remaining natural forests is one of the best things that we can do right now to put us in a good position for climate change. So what does that mean? It means we need to be investing in the capacities of Indigenous peoples and local communities to do what they do. And that means devolving control. That means providing more support than just funding, helping, as you said, Andy, with networking, building connections. Connections between scientists and Indigenous peoples, and that example you showed from Moore have been really powerful. And it's been really gratifying to see Indigenous peoples using work that Pam has been involved in to advocate internationally at the COPs here in New York and to their governments at home. That's also helped give a common sense of purpose across Indigenous peoples from different regions. So all of these things are helpful in building local, regional, global networks of Indigenous peoples who are more effective in advocating for their rights politically and through creative strategic communications campaigns and changing people's minds. Because at the end of the day, a lot of the resistance to supporting Indigenous peoples and local communities, I think, comes from ingrained concepts of discrimination and racism. Sure. And so for Indigenous peoples and communities to tell their own stories and help the rest of us understand who they are and what they do, I think that's also really important in terms of making people feel comfortable with the role that they're going to be playing in managing resources going forward.
So Solange, maybe just a final word from you on this too. What would success look like, knowing this is a long journey, knowing that we're all impatient, especially around climate and biodiversity loss. How much of this is about what we just described, building a basic rights framework and letting go of the conservation context and letting that work itself out, and how much of it's about staying in those climate or biodiversity lenses?
I think donors should dare investing in enabling conditions. And when I talk about enabling condition, for example, the formal recognition of the legal recognition of the collective land rights and resource rights of Indigenous people and local communities. And as some of my colleagues, the panelists said, research has shown that deforestation rates are significantly lower in Indigenous and tribal territories where governments have formally recognized collective land rights. So I think it takes time to really get to that. But once you get it, then you will see like the long-term result. And also talking about conservation, we need to move away from the traditional capitalist or colonial ways of doing conservation by creating fortress or national parks. We need to look into what are the local initiatives around conservation that we can support. How do we make sure that communities can have access to resources for their livelihood? They can have access to resources for their economic development. So I think this is really a good time for donors to invest in different ways of doing conservation, meaning a right-based conservation approach.
Well, this has been a really great discussion, building on a couple we did here a year or two ago about this interface between rights of people on the ground who are living with, among, and utilizing resources harmoniously, and the goals of long-term science-based approaches to conservation and climate safety. I'm really glad you could break away from all the craziness this week and be part of this. Solange at Rights and Resources, the global coalition. Everyone should check out rightsandresources.org. There's much more than just this one report there. Kevin Curry at the Ford Foundation, thanks for all the work you're doing to support capacity, to support to do a little letting go. I do think more. I haven't gotten the more folks on one of these shows yet, but maybe it'd be fun to do that too. And Pam McElwee, McElwee, right?
McElwee, got it. Yeah.
Who's going on sabbatical, heading to Vietnam, not sitting on a beach somewhere. and doing really important work on these issues in the field with Indigenous communities there. Come back sometime soon, all of you. Maybe before COP27, we can do another round here with a couple other people, including, if we can get a good connection, someone based out in the hinterlands. I had someone from Coica, the Amazon network from Guyana, came on the show live once, and it was really useful. This is Andy Revkin, the Columbia Climate School Sustain What webcast, focused on this question of what's the connection between rights and the resources that people on the ground, local and Indigenous communities they're the ones literally on the front lines as these great changes are sweeping the planet. And what can we do in other places to help facilitate their own journey, not to shape it the way we want it. Thanks for tuning in. This can be shared on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, Twitter, wherever the internet lies, and keep well wherever you are. Some last good messages coming in. Lori Abel, thank you for your time, everyone. And Aviva Ramani, who's an artist here in Maine. So glad Indigenous voices about land rights are finally being heard. And John Saylor, thank you for the efforts you're making with helping all Indigenous peoples. Take care, everybody, and good luck with your work and in your lives.
Thank you.
And we're